Hi, this is Yaffi Lvova, registered dietitian nutritionist with Baby Bloom Nutrition, and today we're talking about picky eating through the holidays. Last week I just talked about eating through the holidays, and now we're really focusing on picky eaters, and that's the last time you're going to hear the P word from me. Yeah. So why? Why don't we use the P word? Picky. Why don't we say it? Well, it's really not a great idea to label your kids anything negative anyway. They're growing, and it's a very narrow definition for a developing child. And the truth is, that's a fancy way of saying if you call them any kind of label, they're going to own it, and then you're really going to be in trouble. What a child hears when they hear you call them that label is they hear you're afraid of new foods. That's not really encouraging. They hear we have no expectations of you. And while you shouldn't have expectations in the form of pressure while at the table, kids rise to our expectations. The worst thing as parents that we can do is underrate our children and have low expectations of them. Whatever our expectations are, that's where they're going to raise. That's where they'll be. So we don't call them negative things. And that the P word falls in something negative. So I prefer the term selective. Selective is a much more gentle term. And it may also imply something that's a little bit more of a transient phase. It's a transitional it's a transitional phase. It's something that's not permanent. It's not really it's not as strong a label. And it's really best to just ignore the situation entirely and specifically not talk about it in front of your kids. So keep up your expectations. Your children are amazing and can rise to it. So let them rise to it. Give them the opportunity to really be the adventurous kid that they probably show in other areas of their lives. So here are some tips. When you're getting through the holidays and you have a selective eater on your hands, whether it's your child or maybe your spouse, it happens. And I'm going to start by saying, this is a lot of tips. Okay, here are a lot of tips for you, and you're not going to be able to do all of them. So you're going to pick the ones that are realistic for your family and focus on that. If you try to do all of these, you may drive yourself insane, which is really not the point of this broadcast. So first, what you want to think about is normal food patterns. Before the holidays, what are your kids' normal food patterns? I did a whole nap time nutrition on food jags and normal toddler eating patterns. It is super normal for your kids to skip dinner. Sometimes it's because they're going through a phase. Sometimes it's because they're teething or they are fighting a cold or they have a cold, or maybe they're coming up on some kind of milestone, and that can all affect their appetite. So it's common for them to skip dinner. Also, a lot of times kids really listen to their bodies, and that's why we as parents need to not get in the way of them listening to their bodies. And that's really the big problem with selective eating and pressure at the table, is us getting in the way of their innate cues, those cues that they were born with. They know when they're hungry, they know what to do about it, and they know when they're satisfied and they should stop. So we as parents need to not get in the way of that. So coming back to the beginning of that sentence, which I feel like was a long time ago. So kids load up at the beginning of the day. They have more nutrition with their breakfast, snacks, lunch. By the time they get to dinner, sometimes their bodies just say, hey, given the amount you're growing today, you've had enough. And they don't get hungry, and they skip dinner, and they go to bed without dinner, and it's going to be okay. It happened to us when we were younger. It'll happen to your kids. It'll happen to your grandkids, God willing. And it's a normal pattern. And so it's when we start to see things that are normal as not normal or as a problem, then we're creating a problem. So just know that that is a completely normal thing for your child to go through and for you to go through as a parent. So as far as the actual tips, selective eating tips for the holidays, get your pen out. Keep your normal food and nap schedule as much as possible. Yeah, last week I said don't worry about it. And that's where it comes in as far as what's realistic for your family. If you're going to a big family dinner and it's happening at a time that is not normal for your child, try to adapt the schedule so that you are giving meals and snacks about 2 to 3 hours apart. You don't want to show up to that meal with a completely full belly, but you also don't want your child to be hungry when there are all of these unfamiliar foods. It can be really difficult for them to process all of that sensory experience. And I'm not even just talking about if your child has a sensory processing disorder, in which case this situation would be amplified. But even if you have a child who is neuronormative, who doesn't have any sensory and processing disorders, these holidays are a sensory disaster. The food smells different. It looks different. There are different textures. There are different people wearing different perfumes. There are a lot of people around. So even for your most adventurous child, this is a challenging situation. So try to keep that as even as possible, as normal as possible. If they take a nap, try to maintain that nap if possible. Try to give meals on their normal schedule. If not, space your meals by 2 to 3 hours as much as possible. And that entire point may be completely moot for your family. It may not work for you to follow that point. So you'll follow some of the others that I'll give. Create a safe place for overstimulation. I mentioned how difficult it is for kids to get through the holidays with all of that stimulation, all of those different sensory experiences going on all at the same time. It's a lot. So create a safe place. At my boys' preschool, okay, I'll give a plug to it, Chandler Jewish Preschool and Kindergarten. They're in kindergarten and they have a little safe box that is big enough for one child to fit in, and it has really cool pillows in there, and it's a nice place for them to be. You probably can't recreate exactly that when you're at someone else's house, but you can kind of look around and see if there's a safe place, a corner, probably not a bathroom because other people will need access to it, but you want to find some place where you can go with your child in order to have a quiet moment to regroup and get really back on track. Plan ahead, bring a safe food. It's really common during these family dinners to bring foods. So make sure that what you bring is a safe food, a food that your child will recognize as familiar, something that's readily acceptable by your child. That's going to make the whole experience a little bit easier when your child looks at the table and sees something that's familiar. And you know what? It doesn't have to go with the rest of the meal. That's completely a cultural thing that we say, on Thanksgiving, you have these specific foods, and you wouldn't bring a plate of pasta to Thanksgiving, right? Well, why not? This is really just a cultural norm that we eat those specific foods. But when you're dealing with a selective eater, you want something familiar on the table for them. There may be something built in, like rolls. That's often a safe food for kids. But if you want to bring a bowl of pasta and it doesn't go with what else is on the table, it really doesn't matter. It's for your child and your family to feel safe and comfortable at this dinner. You can talk to the host about it ahead of time, and hopefully they'll be understanding. Bring a safe condiment. Okay, so in my family, that would be coleslaw or ketchup. Ketchup is a really common one, and kids kind of go nuts with the ketchup, but it's a safe place, and it might make foods that are otherwise unfamiliar look safe. So putting a little squirt of ketchup on their plate and letting them dip whatever it is into it, whether that is turkey, which makes sense, or butternut squash pieces in ketchup, which doesn't make any sense to us, might make sense to the child. It's going to make them feel a lot more comfortable, and they may be willing to try other foods. At the very least, it is more likely to ward off a tantrum or some other unpleasant experience. So think of it as your garlic against vampires. Communicate with the child about what's going on. Talk about it ahead of time. These are the things that are going to happen at this party. These are the things you might see. Here are the people you might see. Here are the foods you might experience. Having that open dialogue of conversation is really important. You can even talk about why these foods are traditional, why we fry latkes for Hanukkah, why we have donuts, why we have turkey on Thanksgiving. If there's a reason that you can come up with, or something that really does exist, that's fun to talk about with your kids, and maybe it makes it a little more relatable to them and they'll be a little bit more willing to participate. Don't bring an empty tummy, and that's you and that's the kids. And I mentioned you don't want to be starving. You don't want to be full. You want to be somewhere in between. And it's that sweet spot where they might be, they're more willing to try something new because they're not feeling that pressure of really an empty tummy. But If they don't try something new, you know that they weren't completely starving to begin with, and everyone can have a happy and safe experience. Practice run. We used to do practice runs with parties when we were having a big party, or the first time I did Thanksgiving, we did a practice run with the pies. And this is something you can do with your selective eater. Make the same type of dinner a few days before, a few weeks before, and serve it. And you talk about how we're going to go to this party and here are foods you might see. You may take one type of food and prepare it in different ways and give everyone a scorecard, like the Olympics. You know, the Romanian judge gives it a 7. You can, an article that I read mentioned cranberries specifically. There's cranberry sauce, there's smooth, there's chunky, there's canned, there's homemade, there's cranberry jello, there are cranberry drinks. And you can just put that all out, you know, if you have all that time. Put that all out and talk about how there are different ways to serve the same thing and why we have cranberries and where they grow and what color they are and how they taste. And you can fill out a scorecard. Do you like this? Is it not your taste? Do you like it maybe from this bowl? It's a little bit different. It's a fun activity to do. Discuss different traditions and how they fit in. I talked about that a little bit. Where you come from as a culture and why these foods and why these experiences are important and why it's important to spend time as a family. Creative exposure. Create a new dish together. Okay, so it's really common for Thanksgiving to have mashed sweet potatoes with marshmallows on top, right? I love that dish. I love making it with my kids. But if you can put some kind of spin on it that's unique to your family, that would be awesome for the kids. And you can help them. Maybe you put some pineapple in there. Maybe you have, maybe it's chunky, maybe it's smooth, maybe it's blended. Maybe you have some kind of other ingredient, or you always have to sprinkle cinnamon along the top. Just something that's fun, that's for your family, that you've come up with your kids. And gentle nutrition exposure. Cook together, shop together, look at recipes together. That can be challenging for the younger kids as far as looking at recipes, because they think whatever they choose is going to be on the table in 10 minutes. So you want to make sure that your child is at least 5 years old when choosing recipes that are not for that next meal. But going to a farmer's market, going to a garden, looking at pictures of Thanksgiving dinners, or whatever is coming up, you look at pictures of that. You can watch YouTube videos of whatever. That's all creative exposure, and that gets your kids really involved. You can go to IKEA and for $10 get a basket of plush fruits and vegetables, and there are other foods in there as well. And that's also fun exposure. You can hold the food and play catch with it, or play cornhole with it, whatever. That's a fun, gentle, creative nutrition exposure that helps get your kid a little bit used to that food, so that when it's on the table, it's not the first time they've seen it. Come up with a kitschy name for something. A recent study out of Cornell showed that kids ate twice as many carrots when they were called X-ray vision carrots as opposed to just carrots. So it seems really corny, but it's fun. Come up with a name for something, you know, like rocket ship green beans, you know, whatever it is. Look at something and try to be creative. Have your kids help with that. They're way more creative than we are. Show them a dish and say, what would you call that? And then you make it and you call it that. In my house, we don't have fried eggs. We have exploding eggs. And that's not something I came up with, but it's something I go with because it's fun. Why not? Don't plate for your child. There are so many foods on the table. If you take a small serving of each food and you try to create a sampler platter, that plate is going to be overflowing. And that's really difficult and overwhelming for kids, especially if they have some sensory processing disorders, especially if they have some selective eating tendencies. So what's really the best idea is to go around the table with your child and let them indicate what they're interested in trying. And if you really follow what they say, their plate might start out all tan, bread, plain turkey, mashed potatoes. That's fine. They may get a little bit more adventurous after they have a few bites. So just stick with it. Another thing you can do is, if your children are young enough, they can sit on your lap or on your spouse's lap or on a family member they're very close with, maybe a grandparent. Sitting on your lap, that physical contact helps them to be more adventurous because they feel safe. You give them a really safe place. And if you're comfortable with that, it's a good way to start. So that was a whole lot of tips. A common question I get at this point is, but I belong to some culture where if I don't eat what X person presents, I will insult them. And that is going to be an entirely new topic on its own. Next week, I'm having a fabulous therapist, Helena, join me for talking about establishing boundaries with relatives. I touched on it last week, eating through the holidays, but really the practical tips for establishing boundaries and what to do when that relative really expects you to eat that dish that they brought and you're just not interested and your child just is not interested. So join me next week for that. I'm very excited to have Helena join me. And I hope to see you next week. And in the meantime, if you have any holidays that are starting, I have Hanukkah. Happy holidays to you.